Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I have the impression the average American thinks, well, the corporations do what they want. The oil companies want to raise prices, they raise prices. What are we going to do about it? They got a control on it anyway. And that we really don't have that much to say about it. With government people, we can throw them out of office. They don't do what we want them to do, then we won't elect them again. But we don't have any say about who's running the corporations.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Thomas Klein, professor of marketing at the University of Toledo. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of corporations in a capitalistic system. Here's Father Bacik.
Tom, in the recent past I have heard you speak about the question of business ethics on a couple different occasions. I know you've done some extra studying on the whole question of how corporations function, especially from the viewpoint of ethics. And so therefore I would like to broaden out that discussion a bit and speak about corporations, companies, industry, and how it functions here in our capitalistic system in the United States. Are you game for this kind of discussion?
By all means. The notion of the corporation, of course, is a little different than what you find in classical economic thought. And, of course, the reality of the corporation in a, let's say, contemporary American society involves really four things that have to be kept in mind. I think the notion of the market economy we've discussed at length before, its competitive elements, the incentives that are involved there. What is not attended often in that kind of dialogue is the notion of that the corporation operates within a scheme of laws where we have a regular way of resolving disputes between people by, in a consistent way, by people who are dispassionate or not involved in the system.
Now, wait a second. When you're talking about these laws, where are these laws coming from?
Well, these laws exist in our culture, in our tradition, the common law, of course, and statutory laws which are created by the political side of our system.
Okay, so you'll be talking about things such as antitrust laws, for example. That's an example.
Antitrust law is an example. So is product liability law. So are laws that have to do with pricing discrimination.
Mm-hmm. So these are all statutory laws, things that are on the books and so on. Do you refer at all to the moral law that's at work in the society? Because surely, in some ways, corporations tend to be constrained in that way also. In other words, there's certain behaviors that simply are reprehensible or not tolerated by the public as a whole that would seem to me to operate on the corporations and somehow circumscribe their activity. So if someone builds a car that explodes when you hit it from the back, there's sort of an outrage, a public outrage, in addition, I suppose, to the lawsuits that occur.
Yes,
and that people feel, well, we can't build cars like that.
So two things happen. First of all, there is created, I suppose, at least the question of obligation on the part of the automobile manufacturer to the people who were injured when that car blows up. And then secondly, a signal is sent to state and federal legislatures that maybe we ought to have some controls about how cars are actually constructed, or something that specifies more clearly what liabilities are in those kind of circumstances.
And then you get the debate going on about how far that should go, right? So you have Ralph Nader wanting to have the airbags in the cars and have that mandated by federal law, and you have other people who are saying, well, that hurts the economy and makes the cars cost more, and that people ought to be free to use airbags or to take safety precautions if they wish. I take it that that's one of the debates then goes on that the corporate world has to be attentive to.
Right, or an even more sophisticated kind of argument that between let's say the Nader position, which says that the public should design the car in some respect, and I suppose what would be a responsible business position that said, well, the public really shouldn't design the car. Automotive engineers who work for companies should design the car. But yes, perhaps the public ought to set some performance standards or some limits that these engineers can work with. And that would be a more efficient way, a less heavy-handed way of achieving an automobile or a means of transportation for society that, in terms of its cost and its effectiveness in all dimensions, not just the safety dimension.
That's a difficult question. Where do you come down on this question of the airbags as an example? Just personally, what do you think that they ought to be mandated federally or not?
Well, that...
What am I going to get?
You didn't prepare me.
Answers.
You're going to get an equivocal answer. I suppose I would say I am not in favor of a mandated airbag.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want me to give you an equivocal rationale for that position?
No. Once you've stated the position, you ought to be able to give a clear rationale, I would think. Well, it's a trade-off, isn't it?
There are trade-offs. There are trade-offs on the cost side, and there are trade-offs on the effectiveness side. And, of course, there's a philosophical argument of should people who are willing to be safe drivers and use seat belts and so forth, basically drive responsibly, should they be forced to pay an extra $300 to $600 for an item which really they get no use from?
Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, we're arguing that 50,000 people are killed on the highway each year, and that we have to be concerned with that kind of question.
Certainly. Continuing the context point that I started off with, much of this works out to the extent that you have sound management involved in these corporations, people who are obviously technically competent, but the corporations have to be or the corporation's management has to be sensitive to these longer-term kinds of questions that have to do with the environment, that have to do with product safety. And they have to be accountable ultimately to the public to some degree, and certainly to their owners. That's built into most corporate charters.
Do you think that the average American thinks that way? I have the impression the average American thinks, well, the corporations do what they want. The oil companies want to raise prices, they raise prices. What are we going to do about it? They got a control on it anyway. And that we really don't have that much to say about it. With government people, we can throw them out of office. They don't do what we want them to do, then we won't elect them again. But we don't have any say about who's running the corporations.
Well, but
by and large, we don't have much choice about whether we buy the products. You got to buy gas, and all of the oil companies are in the same boat. Doesn't the average man talk like that?
I suspect maybe that does occur, but we can look at just the last 10 years and what's happened to the automotive industry and say that, well, the system really does work. In the same way that we can shift our voting allegiance from one representative or president or mayor to another, we obviously shift our allegiance from one automobile manufacturer to another, from one oil company to another. And not only that, but in at least in a longer run sense, and by the long run I really only mean a year or two, we may decide, or are free to decide, that we don't want to buy a car at all, that we want to ride the bus more, or walk more, or ride bicycles more. Now, you'd say that's really not a practical answer for most people, but certainly what has occurred is that we have, to a large extent, stopped buying American automobiles and started buying foreign automobiles because we, or at least 25% of us or so, felt that those products were more desirable in one respect or another.
So you're saying that it does operate as a constraint on the corporations eventually. Do you think that some corporations sort of just disregard that? What about Nestle, for example, with the boycott that's going on, a very practical kind of situation? So the word is that Nestle's has these people that go around in the third world countries into the hospitals and give them to give the women who have given birth to children samples of formula for their children, and that once they begin to use it, then they can no longer breastfeed their children, and we've got all kind of problems as a result. There's organizations I know in the United States that, in fact, who is trying to fight against that and boycott Nestle products and so on. And their claim is that Nestle isn't responsive to the boycott, that indeed they keep doing this, that they've changed a few practices, but they've still got these ads, and they still give the free samples to the women in the hospitals after they've given birth.
Well, there are flaws in any system, I suppose. There also have to be recognized some trade-offs that the Nestle third world formula problem, to a large extent, occurs, I think, originally because Nestle did not adequately anticipate some of the problems with poor sanitary systems and poor feeding habits, nutritional education on the part of the mothers and families involved, and perhaps didn't control, within a larger sense, control the marketing system that delivered and promoted those products in that context. I think probably Nestle has reacted or responded to the criticisms reasonably well. Is it perfect? No. Part of the problem, of course, is, again, you're getting into these trade-off areas. Who should decide whether a society, a third world society, should have access to formula or not, and who should decide how best that formula should be distributed, should be sold or marketed or promoted in that society? Obviously, Nestle views its role as paramount in that area, and those who criticize Nestle would argue that no, they are better commentators on that, or better designers of marketing systems, and in fact those societies would perhaps be better off without it.
Well, it brings us to a crucial point, it seems to me, that when Nestle's or any other corporation looks at a particular market and so on, it seems to me that their primary concern is profit, that's why they exist. They exist to make money, to give a return to shareholders. They're responsible to their board of directors for doing well and growing and so on. And that's what they are all about, so that when they look at a given market or a given possibility, that their first inclination is to say, how are we going to maximize profit in any given situation? Now, I believe that there no doubt are constraints built into that. There can be countervailing forces so that one can say, well, we could make more money by selling this particular product to poor people, but we're not going to do it because there would be such a public outrage that it simply wouldn't work. I know a person who was high up in a particular company. I don't know if I should say the name of the company, but when they did something good, that they could have made a lot of money selling a particular product to the poor, and they didn't do it for, as I'm told anyway, for humane or moral reasons. But I don't want to divert from the point I'm trying to make, is that they start out, it seems to me, in a capitalistic system with saying, we want to make money, we're in business to make profit. That's the first consideration in the boardroom as the discussion goes on. And then it only is if the other forces can somehow be brought to bear to modify that in some way. So you're saying, well, what about those women in the third world? It seems to me that there are people who are more disinterested who say, hey, we want the good for those babies, we want the good for those mothers, and they ought to be the kind of people who have a great input into decision making here.
Well, the corporation operates in a market system. A market system involves both a buyer and a seller. The reason why Nestle was economically successful is that there were buyers for its products, people who felt, based on the information they had at least, that these formula products were good for them and were worth what they were paying, which really wasn't very much, of course. So it was all subsidized by the government.
Free at first.
At first, sure.
But Tom, then right away we're into the question of advertising, aren't we? And we're using this. I think the example is probably a good one. The claim is that these people are not sophisticated, these mothers, that they see, I've seen described the pictures they show them of healthy babies who are fed with these formulas and so on, implication being that's how to make your baby healthier. These women have no way of really sorting that all out or understanding. There's a whole implication that the more sophisticated Western way of doing it, I suppose, is to use the formula instead of breastfeeding and so on. I mean, what about the morality here? I mean, there's the question of standards of advertising, ethical norms that are used. I mean, isn't there a manipulation that's involved in that? It's not just as simple as saying, well, we're selling this product and you got the money and you want to buy it, go ahead. It isn't like that.
It's a very tough problem for corporations because they frequently are, we're talking about consumer goods particularly, they're frequently dealing with people who are less sophisticated than they are. So there's an imbalance in knowledge, and with that imbalance of knowledge goes a responsibility to provide complete, accurate, truthful information as part of the advertising and selling function. Did Nestle meet that criterion? At least initially, I think is a very arguable point. The fourth element in this, of course, in this context that we talked about, might be brought in here too, Jim, and that is that there is a public policy that operates around or that blankets, that limits, that encourages the corporation in certain areas. It's interesting to note that in these third world countries, that in fact that public policy has not particularly been effective or chosen to inhibit or encourage particular kinds of behavior. Ideally, we would have a competitive system in which there were competing products for, to continue the Nestle story, competing ways of feeding babies. You didn't seem to have it that way, so yeah, you've got an example of monopolistic capitalism at work in an underdeveloped country where it operates in an imbalance both on the competitive side or horizontal side and on the customer side or vertical side. In situations like that in Western Europe and the United States, we have government emerging as controlling in some way, perhaps providing additional information. In these third world countries, this didn't happen. The explanation of that is not totally clear, I don't think, to anybody. It certainly isn't clear to me. But in part, I suppose, government felt that on balance, the governments in these third world countries felt that on balance the product was useful. It also could be argued, I suppose, that those governments were influenced by the political power of Nestle in that situation. But in any event, what we might call this idealized system, which largely seems to operate in the advanced world, advanced economies, when situations like that arise, then you find government through public policy emerging with a law, with regulation that sort of balances the system.
And I suppose that raises a number of questions. One is that the whole relationship of the corporate world then to the governmental structures in the society, what kind of control that we expect there, how we get more care, I suppose, for the common good. Although I do understand the argument of the people who argue in favor of corporate life and of the capitalistic system is that somehow the enlightened self-interest of these corporations will lead to increase in the common good. It's going to help more people and provide more jobs. I guess it's one way of saying it is that trickle-down metaphor, that if if the corporations are doing well and making a lot of money, and a few people at the top are making a lot of money, that somehow that is going to increase the economic pie, and that is going to trickle down and benefit the poorest people in the United States. I was thinking of what to make of this. I don't know, Michael Novak's comment in his book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. He compares the United States with South America and Latin America and says that, why is it that we prosper and they don't? Why are we have moved ahead so far? Because, the lands are discovered at the same time. The resources are roughly equivalent. I mean, there are great resources in Latin and South America. And why is it that we have prospered and they haven't? And Novak's idea, I think, is that the whole capitalistic system has been the reason for that. That we have had free enterprise and great initiative, and that has involved the making of a middle class and working class that is well off, whereas in Latin and South America that hasn't happened. I know that is how he argues in favor to show the advantage of this corporate kind of structure that we're talking about here.
Right. Well, of course, I think if you look at the larger question, there are also cultural differences between Latin America and North America, and Latin versus Germanic cultural differences that are important, and not insubstantial are the climate differences. The fact that it really takes more effort to survive in Ohio, for example, than it does in most areas of South America and indeed Central America.
Well, if I might respond to my own point then, too, one of the points would be the religious differences that exist as well. You go back to Max Weber's classic study of capitalism and the Protestant ethic, and I think that there we get the idea that the Protestant ethic, which talked about establishing the kingdom and that being able to sort of devise the criteria for whether you were saved or not, indicated that one be hard-working and be involved in trying to transform the world and so on, and that this indeed would lead to the rise of an industrial factory kind of system as we've known it, a capitalistic system. And whereas in the Latin countries we've had more of a Catholic ethic, and which would seem to be more easygoing and not produce the kind of hard work, initiative, drive to accumulate money and so on that we associate with success in this world.
Well, there's the work ethic versus the mañana ethic, and but I suppose the mañana ethic, in a sense, describes in a way the ethic of any Christian nation. There are other points that are brought out in Novak's writing on that Latin American question, which extends one way or another through a couple of different chapters in there, and which was, I believe, in Harper's about a year ago, for folks who want to get a condensed version of that argument. The social structure of Latin America, these are chicken and egg kind of propositions, but the social structure in Latin America almost from the very beginning seemed to generate a few very large landowners with really carried the feudal society from Europe to Latin America in a way that North America was a society of yeomen and independent farmers, and the large plantation developed, to be sure, in the South, and perhaps that's a function of the climate and the soil and what was raised in those areas. But if we think about North American agriculture and how that relates to the social structure until the modern industrial period, at least, you get a very different kind of social structure. The few large landowners holding most of the wealth and most of the land, and many poor serfs of a sort, or campesinos, comprising the bulk of the population, and that just didn't exist in North America. I don't, of course, I think the larger question, Jim, that you and we could discuss this forever, is that it's very difficult to pin down these kinds of things on one or even two.
Yeah, what the variables are that cause that. Yeah, and I think you're right, and there's no doubt a number of factors involved. Maybe we've isolated a few, though, in our discussion. Tom, I remember you saying one time this kind of statement. You said the corporations were, by and large, more moral than the churches. And I think that perhaps we ought to talk about that a little bit. I remember I took great exception to that at the time. Why don't you say briefly what you meant by that kind of statement, and then let me totally refute it.
Well, let's see, and you get the last word on this program, don't you? Let's say it was not only the churches that I was speaking of in that
governments,
speech, universities, etc. And I think the major thing that speaks for morality in the corporation, aside from any enlightened vision on the part of its managers or owners, is that the nature of the system in which it operates, the competitive system, the market system, creates sanctions. When it is moral, it is rewarded, and when it is immoral, it is penalized. And those kinds of sanctions don't seem to exist in other areas. Now, I don't want to take your thunder, but to be sure, churches are constitutionally, I suppose, more moral than corporations. After all, corporations are just supposed to make good services and in exchange for money, and that isn't a terribly lofty goal. But while churches are supposed to save souls and bring people to the kingdom in some way or other, but in their abuses, corporations are less able to abuse and less able to engage in the abuses they do engage in for very long periods of time than I think governments or universities or churches.
People in Youngstown, where they close the mills down, might not agree with that kind of statement when they're suffering such terrible economic deprivation now. I think that you have indeed made the substance of my rebuttal to your point. It seems to me the difference is that other structures like universities are in search for the truth generally, and governments are in business of trying to create just societies, and churches are in the business of spreading the kingdom, whereas corporations are in the business of making money and maximizing profit. Now, I agree that there are certain constraints on industry. I can see that from what you said. I think you argue that well. But on the other hand, their dominant motive to want to make money seems to me to suggest much of their behavior. And unless they're challenged or checked in some way, that they are going to proceed on that particular motivation to make money. And I agree, I don't have to defend the churches. The churches have had their history of abuses of individuals and of groups, and it's a checkered history, there's no doubt about it, but it still seems to me the fundamental feeling or mood or motivation of the whole thing is to inculcate love and spread the kingdom. I think that's where the difference. That's one reason why I would like to say that, from the Christian viewpoint, somehow there has to be judgment made on the capitalistic system, and we have to be trying to figure out how to make the corporations more responsive and to help them to create more humane kind of situations.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Thomas Klein, professor of marketing at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's reflections was corporations in a capitalistic system. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections, in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.